All right, and then let's get a clean stream. Excuse me. Yeah, it's a new link now.
So how? You said there was going to be another person talking. How long?
No, I think she's offering commentary on the presentation, so I don't know if that's before, during, and after, or just one of those two. But she'll be off to the side, I think.
Okay. Well, we've got a makeshift microphone set up right over there, so Christian can go over there.
Well, she has the lapel.
But I don't have access to that system.
Oh, so that doesn't. Is there a way to do the rubber band thing with that? With her, with the law mic?
I'm gonna have you two.
We're basically going to
talk that through.
essentially. Yeah.
It's okay if I just audio test real quick. Oh, yeah. Test 1, 2. Test 1, 2. Test 1, 2. Check. Check 1. Test 2. Test 1, 2. All right. Test 1, 2. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Test 1, 2. Sharp focus citizen fast.
Oh, is it? Oh, that's awesome. That's great. That's awesome. And you're heading out of here, right?
Yes.
I'm gonna be recording the event. I just want to let you know you have a live stream at the top.
Okay.
Yeah, so I used to do. I got a buddy and I from like 6 years. We're staying at Siggy Hart House. We're getting across. So it's like old school dormitory. Oh my gosh. Yeah, got Q&A for the recording, just not the stream. So. I know. I've never heard of speaking country to talk about it. So I've been flying all over because they have checkers in LA, they got checkers in New York, they got DC. Been a lot of work. I've never seen you quite an expert. That was impressive. Yeah. Well, good to see you. Thanks a lot. Will do. Awesome. Great to see you.
Yeah. And
Not studies. Yeah. So that's I made it. But then I get to the PLLC classes. That's right. With the band in the background.
Where's the band? Yeah. We keep it
Oh,
well.
I'm just careful.
make sure it actually turns off here. 1,000, 2,000, 3,000.
Do it close up. I remember having both of you guys over.
Yeah.
I just got up with Andrea for 2 minutes. We each made some readings.
Okay. I texted him my call last week.
Hey, see you. How are you? Oh, yeah. Hasn't sleep.
Right, so there's a part of that. Is this the
Yeah,
clicker?
so it's off right now. The on button's right there. It works great if you're right in here, but as soon as you get outside of the podium,
Okay.
like the podium blocks the signal or
Should I
something.
test
So
it?
if you want, yeah, it should work fine when you're this close. But then if you're walking all the way over here,
I'm not gonna walk.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think we're probably ready to be marked, but I think Philip's going to introduce Merlot and Merlot's going to introduce you. So
Great.
yeah.
Thank you for everything.
Yeah, of course. Let me know. Do you need anything else? Or are you good? Okay.
Have you? It's going to be longer than that. We have you sit there. I'll make sure you
Less awkward. Yeah. And you just introduce me. I'm not bad.
Yeah.
Welcome. Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for coming, especially on such a beautiful fall day. I'm really excited about today's event. It's actually something we've been wanting to do for several years. That COVID delayed this event, and then scheduling was a little bit difficult, but I'm so pleased it's finally happening. Just a few announcements to begin. So I'm Philip Munoz. I'm the director of the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government. It's certainly my pleasure to welcome you to our talk today. The center, the mission of the center is to foster responsible citizenship. We want our Notre Dame students to be the salt of the earth. And part of the way they do that is to know the principles of the American regime. That's one of our main focuses here at the center. We run a minor, a constitutional studies minor. We run an undergraduate fellowship, our Menard Family Tocqueville Fellows. For the undergraduates here interested in the minor, please come talk to me, or interested in the fellowship. The fellows, they meet with our speakers. They had breakfast with our speaker this morning. They get all sorts of special opportunities, extracurricular activities. They tell me what to do. I try to invite speakers. We fund their internships in the summers. So if you're interested in getting involved with the center, please come talk to me. We're always looking to meet and serve our undergraduate fellows. The minor is great if you're interested in events like today's. The minor is a cortex on constitutional government, principles, philosophy, comparative. So come talk to me too if you're interested in the minor. And for everyone, even our older students, if you want to get on our email list, there's a QR code in the back and sign-up sheets. Zane, where's Zane? Zane over here has sign-up sheets, so if you want to know what we're doing or where you can find that free lunch, get on our email list. We have a couple events later on this fall that I want to invite you to. Next week, we're actually doing a breakfast event. Next week at 9 o'clock breakfast, and at 9:30 there's a panel on a recent book on religious liberty. Harvey Mansfield, perhaps the nation's most distinguished political theorist, he's also 92 years old, just retired from Harvard, is going to be commenting, as well as Judge Sutton on the Sixth Circuit, and Michael Moreland, a Notre Dame alumnus, will be commenting on a recent book. I'm told it's a very good book. That's next Friday, 9 o'clock breakfast, 9:30 is the event. Justice Kagan is here this afternoon, so we moved it to breakfast. And then Friday, October 13th, the center will be hosting former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. So that talk is Friday afternoon. I believe our talk is going to be at 4 p.m., but wait for details. And you'll all be invited to that. That's going to be a ticketed event. I'm not exactly sure how you get tickets, but I'll have all the tickets. So if you want tickets, let me know. Okay. So please visit our website, constudies.nd.edu. Let me thank the staff of the center, especially Zane and Debbie. They worked very hard, and Jen Smith, setting up everything. So thank you to the staff. We have the bookstores here selling books of Unshackled. So if you want a book, and I'm sure Kate will sign copies of the book afterwards. Anything I left out I'm supposed to announce? Okay, we have a student do our introduction. I'm just going to say just a quick word of my own. I have the best job in the world, and my students are like my kids. And when you see your kids go out and do great things, it just fills me with pride. So this is our second fellow who's come to speak at Notre Dame. I'm just thrilled about today's event. So Merlot Fogarty, Constitutional Studies minor, will do our introduction.
Thank you. Kate Hardiman Rhodes is an alumna of Notre Dame and the Menard Family Tocqueville Fellowship. She graduated in 2017 with a BA summa cum laude in the program of liberal studies. She also holds a master's degree in education from Notre Dame's ACE program, which led her to teach high school in Chicago. She then earned her law degree at Georgetown Law School. She has clerked for Judge Trevor McFadden on the District Court for the District of Columbia and is currently an associate at Cooper Kirk. She will soon clerk for Judge Gregory G. Katsas on the DC Circuit. Nicole Garnett, one of the most distinguished professors of law here at Notre Dame, will be offering commentary on Kate's work in education policy. Professor Garnett received her BA with distinction in political science from Stanford University and her JD from Yale Law School. Professor Munoz originally asked one of our alumni fellows to do this introduction, but he had a prior commitment out of the country. Thomas Hardiman, Notre Dame class of 1987, sent along some words to introduce his daughter and our speaker. He says, "Since Kate was a teenager, she has expressed concern about the quality of American primary and secondary education. As she was working on her senior thesis, Kate taught me that it's incorrect to debate whether our children should have school choice or not. The truth is that the great majority of Americans already have school choice. They have the resources to send their children to private or parochial schools or to move to a nice suburb with strong public schools. So the only American children who don't have school choice are those who most desperately need it, the poor. So the real question is this: can our great republic continue to deny the least fortunate among us the opportunity for a first-rate education? The answer should be a resounding no." Judge Hardiman continues, "Like any parents, Lori and I are gratified that Kate has worked tirelessly to become well-educated, but she was not let out el educo by herself. She was privileged to have Notre Dame's Tocqueville program, the Center for Citizenship and Constitutional Government, and the program of liberal studies. And Lori and I are most pleased that Kate is using her education and many talents in the spirit of Our Lady, for the love of God and of neighbor." Today, Kate will be discussing her 2021 book, Unshackled, Freeing America's K-12 Education System, which she co-authored with Clint Bollock, a justice on the Arizona Supreme Court. We are delighted to welcome Mrs. Hardiman Rhodes back to Notre Dame.
Thank you so much, Merlot, and thank you to Professor Munoz and the Center for having me today. I can't say what an honor it is to be back speaking at my alma mater and to a program that meant so much to me while I was here. And I'm also grateful to Professor Garnett for giving her time today to be with us. She's been a great inspiration to me throughout my career, starting as an undergrad, and I hope to emulate her example as I work in this field going forward. I'm here today to speak about our book, Unshackled, which discusses some of the issues plaguing American education. It also argues for certain solutions, which I look forward to introducing to you in a bit. But first, I'm going to begin by stating the obvious. Things have changed a lot in 100 years. For example, we started with Ford's Model T. Today, we have Teslas. This is a telephone in 1923. Today, we have iPhones. This is a printer in 1923. Here's one today. I have one more for you. This is what a classroom looked like in 1923. This is what a classroom looks like today. To be sure, there have been some changes. We've given every kid a laptop. Or we've even given them yoga balls when they start falling asleep in class. But you'll see desks in rows, students facing front, 1 or 2 teachers at the front of the class. I use the image of a classroom as a metaphor. Many aspects of American public education have remained largely the same. For example, a school day that runs from 7 or 8 in the morning until 3 or 4 in the afternoon. A school year that includes summer vacation, 12 grades, advancement of students by age, not ability, a focus on the same basic content areas, the same basic curricular topics within those content areas. Let's think about this for a second. We have to ask ourselves, why, in a period of such great technological and societal change, why has the classroom remained largely the same? Have we just perfected it? After all, some innovations have stood the test of time, like books. Maybe the public school is one such creation. After all, somewhere between 76 and 82%, or about 50 million American students, attend them. With all those numbers, surely we are doing something right. Unfortunately, the data shows that the traditional public school is working less well over time. I'll pause now to define a term. By traditional or district public school, I mean your neighborhood public school. In other words, the one you must attend based on your zip code or the attendance zone in which your house is located. This type of school continues to be the most common today. To visualize, consider a map of my hometown, Pittsburgh. You can see the school boundaries in different colors here. You may notice that the boundaries appear arbitrary and jagged in places, while others track natural boundaries such as rivers. School districts are a bit like gerrymandered political districts, if you're familiar with that concept. Okay, now that we've defined that important term, I'm gonna go back to my teaching days and get a little audience participation from you. So I'm going to ask you what you think we spend to send one student to a district public school in some major cities today. Let's start with Philadelphia. I'd like a show of hands. Who thinks we spend $10,000 or less per student in Philadelphia? How about $20,000 per student or less? How about $30,000 or less per student? Okay, we're pretty good. In 2023, we're projected to spend about $22,379 per student in Philadelphia. Now let's do Boston. Who thinks, well, we can skip to 10,000. We can skip 10,000. Who thinks we spend $20,000 or less in Boston? How about $30,000 or less? All right, you guys are good. It's just north of that. We're projected to spend about $31,000 in Boston this year. Finally, let's do New York City. As you can imagine, the numbers are going to continue to go up. So who thinks we can spend $20,000 or less per student? How about $30,000 or less? One brave soul. $40,000 or less. All right, you guys are very smart. $38,000. These are exorbitant sums of money. Think about it this way. A classroom of 30 students in New York City automatically receives more than $1 million when those students cross the threshold. And while these cities are certainly on the high end of the spectrum for spending, the national average is somewhere between $15,000 and $16,000 per child for 1 year of public schooling. The bottom line is that we're spending a lot of money on our district public schools. And you'd expect, with all that financial input, that our results would be stellar. After all, other types of schools that we will discuss, such as Catholic or charter schools, typically educate students for less than $15,000 a year. even in major metropolitan areas. But it's undeniable that public schools are struggling. This is especially true in urban areas. Here are some 2019 statistics for you, back before the pandemic hit. In Philadelphia, about 60% of students, grades 3 through 8, scored proficient or better in English, and about 42% did so in math. In New York City, similar story, 47% proficiency in English, 45% proficiency in math. And keep in mind, proficient means these students have met the minimum level required by the state or district. It does not mean they are excelling. If a third grader is not proficient in reading, it probably means that he or she cannot read. Despite knowing this data, we continue to invest more and more money in district public schools, hoping that money will improve outcomes. But throwing more money at the problem has had little to no impact. Unless you think I'm just cherry-picking major coastal cities, we will do a more representative example. Peoria, Illinois is a quintessential Midwestern town. It spends just north of the national average per pupil in its district public schools, about $17,000 per child. A few journalists recently did a deep dive into the city's public schools. What they found shocked them. At one high school, not a single student could do math at grade level. At 11 other schools, fewer than 5% could read at grade level. Looking at just high school seniors, only 14% were proficient in English, but 80% graduated. Strangely, Illinois rated these schools highly. One was rated commendable, the state's second highest rating, even though just 1% of children were proficient in math and English. And 100% of Peoria's teachers were rated excellent or proficient. So clearly, poor performance without realizing it is not just a coastal city problem. Looking nationally, the current statistics are as follows. Only 30% of fourth graders were rated proficient or above in math in 2022, and only 33% were proficient or above in English. Only 26% of eighth graders are proficient or above in math, and only 31% are proficient or above in English. Perhaps worse, 90% of parents think that their child is reading or doing math at grade level. So there's a massive gap in what the system is accomplishing and our perception of how well it is working. And if we look at how US students perform on an international standardized test, it's not looking so great either. We rank 25th in the world, behind almost every East Asian country, plus Poland, Slovenia, the UK, New Zealand, Canada, Germany, and more. If another public program had these results, would we let it continue to operate? Not only that, would we continue to give it more money year after year? Americans are starting to realize that they should be asking these questions. The pandemic pulled back the curtain to reveal some of the inertia and stagnation in traditional public schools. Parents became more exposed to what their children were learning. Others disliked the rigor of their kids' curriculum when they saw it in their living room. But when the dust settled, it was clear things had taken a nosedive. Many state tests were canceled in 2020, and after they were reinstated in 2022, the data showed marked learning losses across the nation. In Philadelphia, for example, English proficiency declined from about 60% to 54%, and math proficiency declined from about 42% to 34%. And as I already alluded to, student scores on a nationwide test averaged lower than they had for 2 decades. Most importantly, as you can see from this graphic, the pandemic hurt all students on average in district schools. Virtually every arrow in this graphic is pointing down, signaling some measure of learning loss. Worse, as you can see on the left side of the chart, districts with socioeconomically disadvantaged students lost more years of learning on average than districts with affluent children. Now, the pandemic was a particularly acute wake-up call, but our problems have predated it. In fact, traditional public schools have remained largely stagnant in outcomes since the 1970s. But we have largely pursued the same two remedies: more money and more staff with limited results. One of the blessings of the pandemic was that parents started to demand different solutions in education. Our book, Unshackled, discusses many of them, and I'll share some with you soon. But boiled down to its most basic, our philosophy is this: parents are the primary educators of their children, not the state. This means they should be financially and informationally empowered to choose the school or method of learning that works best for their child. You may have heard this described as school choice before. The basic idea behind school choice, or backpack funding as it's sometimes called, is that education flows to students and parents, not district schools. Now, a number of policy levers can be pulled to implement these basic ideas, and some have been around for decades, thanks to intrepid reformers such as Professor Garnett and my co-author, Justice Bullock. And we're at an inflection point right now because these policies are really starting to gain momentum, and a few new ones have come into the forefront recently. Before getting into the policies, I'm first going to show you the spectrum of different school options that exist today, or school sectors. I imagine you will all be familiar with these. Obviously, there are traditional public schools, which we've already discussed. These are publicly funded and publicly run. Next on the spectrum are what are called charter schools. These are technically public schools because they're funded with state money, but they differ from district public schools because they are privately managed. This gives them flexibility to innovate, to serve the students they teach. For example, charters can implement different curriculum to help students who are behind. They can have more rigorous discipline, mandate parental involvement with student learning, change the length of the school day or the school year, and more. Most of them also do not permit teachers to unionize, so they have more hiring and firing power than traditional public schools. This means they can retain strong teachers and remove struggling ones. You may have heard of charter school networks such as KIPP, Success Academies, and others. They largely started in urban centers as an antidote to traditional public schools, and they have had great success. We profile some of the most truly innovative models in our book. The next bucket is private school. These may be religious or non-religious, and these schools are privately funded, meaning parents pay out of pocket or a child receives a scholarship to attend them. They also have flexibility to break from the one-size-fits-all model to better serve their students. Now, this last bucket is the one that you may not be familiar with. It's an oversimplified conglomeration of schooling options, but I've labeled it decentralized. This can include homeschooling inside the home, a homeschool co-op with other families, or something called a micro school. While homeschooling has been around for a long time, micro schools are relatively new. There's no one way to micro school, but you can think of them as a variation on homeschooling. A group of parents might get their kids together and hire various teachers and tutors to provide small group or one-on-one instruction. Like homeschooling, they allow for greater customization and personalization of learning. Approximately 125,000 micro schools now exist across the country, and each serves between 5 and 25 students. As for how many students are in each sector, we don't have exact figures, and it changes every year. However, here are some rough estimates. As I mentioned, traditional public schools still dominate. About 50 million kids are in them. Following, we have private schools with about 11 million, and then charters with about 4 million, and the decentralized options has about 3 million and growing. And post-COVID, we see a massive shift. The estimated share of students attending traditional public schools declined by about 9%. All of the other sectors, on the other hand, witnessed large increases in total enrollment. And sometimes these figures don't tell the whole story. For example, charter enrollment only increased 4% post-pandemic. But this may be a function of how many charter schools are actually available. Most cities with charter schools have dramatic wait lists for those schools. For example, Success Academies in New York City received 17,000 applicants for only about 3,000 seats. That leaves a wait list of more than 14,000 students. DC has a similar situation, as do many other cities. So how do we decide who gets to leave their traditional public school and attend a charter? Well, we do the most logical thing, randomly decide. You think I'm joking, but I'm not. We allocate students to charters using a lottery system. Children are assigned numbers, and we leave it up to chance who gets a better education. If you're interested in doing a deeper dive on that topic, I highly recommend the movie Waiting for Superman, which humanizes the stories behind charter waitlists and enrollment. Now that we have an understanding of the buckets and who is in them and some trends, we can return to the key philosophy. What does it look like for parents to be the primary educators and for education dollars to follow the child? On the most basic level, it means that parents get to choose which sector their child attends, and they receive funding to do so. Let's walk through some scenarios. We now have our parents up here at the top of the slide with their child. This child is automatically assigned by the zip code of her residence to a district school. And I want to pause for a second to clarify something. I'm not suggesting by the numbers I presented earlier that every district school in the country is bad or failing. I attended one for high school that served me well. But the point is that my parents and many others chose to move to our suburb so that I could go to that school. Moving to a good school district is the most basic form of school choice. Unfortunately, it's only available for parents with the means to do so. So let's say our parents on the slide can't afford to move to a suburb with a good traditional public school, and their assigned school has poor outcomes, isn't safe, or otherwise isn't right for their child. What happens then? Well, the parents could pay out of pocket to attend a private school, or they could pay out of pocket to opt for a decentralized model, like homeschooling. But they are going to have to cover those costs. And if we assume both parents are working and they can't afford to move, these options may be unfeasible too. Another option, obviously, may be the charter school. But then we run into the lottery issue. If the child were to get in using the lottery, the state would pay for her tuition. If the child doesn't win the lottery, it looks like she'll be attending the traditional public school. What I've just described is the reality for many families in America. But there is a different way. Certain states have passed school choice programs. In these states, the money follows the child and funds her rather than defaulting to the district public school. Accessing charters is the same, but the means of accessing the other two sectors changes. There are a few policy mechanisms that we'll get into, but think about it this way first. Let's stipulate that the per pupil average in this state is the national average, $15,000. The state can pass a school choice program, placing some percentage of that money, ideally the largest percentage possible, into the child's backpack. It follows her where she and her parents choose to go. It could defray the costs of private school or fund one of the decentralized options. A school choice program is the surest way for this child to get out of a district public school not working for her. The fight that Professor Garnett and others have been engaged in over the last few decades has been the creation and expansion of these programs. So we'll briefly discuss the major types and where they exist. Vouchers are the oldest form of school choice, and they're also in some ways the simplest in terms of functionality. Money is taken from state government revenue and is made available for parents to use at private schools. Now, when voucher programs first came about, they were challenged as violating the First Amendment's Establishment Clause. Challengers argued that direct state aid to private schools, many of which are religious, constituted state advancement of religion. This was impermissible, they argued, because the Establishment Clause requires state neutrality toward religion. Then, in 2002, the Supreme Court held in a case called Zellman v. Simmons-Harris that Ohio's school choice program was neutral with respect to religion because it delegated the choice of school to parents. Contrary to the challenger's argument, the state was not privileging religious schools over non-religious ones. The parents were. There are fewer Establishment Clause fights about vouchers today. In fact, the new Establishment Clause challenge is to a different issue. At least one charter school in Oklahoma has designated itself as explicitly religious. Now, if you recall, charter schools are technically considered public schools because they automatically receive state money. But they also have elements of private school because they're privately managed. So does a Catholic charter violate the Establishment Clause? It's complicated, and Professor Garnett may be able to touch on this, but under the Supreme Court's recent line of education law cases, there are decent arguments that it doesn't. It's a fascinating issue because if the religious charter prevails, it sets a precedent for state aid flowing to religious schools in states where there are no other forms of choice. Tax credit scholarships are our next policy. Here, the money comes from private individuals or corporations, not state governments. The private corporations will donate to a nonprofit, which can then distribute scholarships to parents for use at private schools. Tax credit scholarships tend to be less vulnerable to legal challenge because the pot of money originates in private hands, not the state. Finally, we have the newest form of school choice, which are education savings accounts, or ESAs for short. ESAs take some percentage of the money a state would have spent on a child and put it into an account. That pot of money is then divided and made available to parents. Now, the functionality of these programs is a little bit different in every state, but generally, if you're familiar with the idea of a health savings account, you have an account and then you have a card linked to that account that can be spent on qualifying expenses. For an ESA, the qualifying expense is something educational. And this is a consequential difference from the other two programs on the slide. Most importantly, it expands school choice to the decentralized sector I mentioned. Now, as Professor Garnett and others have written, ESA implementation can be a challenge. Obviously, we want to make sure that parents are using the money for qualified educational expenses, not something else. And states can choose to define qualifying educational expenses broadly, covering everything from at-home chemistry kits, to Chinese language tutors, to tuition at private school, to a tutor, you name it. A state can either pre-approve purchases on the front end or audit them on the back end. In our view in the book, ESAs hold great promise. They enable parents to have the most choice and control over their child's schooling. And as noted, they facilitate the expansion of homeschools and microschools, which have traditionally been underserved by vouchers and tax credit scholarship programs. One last thing to note about all of these programs is that often they're means tested. In other words, backpack funding becomes available to the most disadvantaged students first. Now, that's changing a little bit. Some of the recent ESA programs and tax credit scholarships are expanding, and they're called universal. We're going to talk about that in a little bit with Professor Garnett, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but in general, these programs, they came about to help those most disadvantaged students in district public schools. So here's a map of where these programs can be found. You may notice that some states have several types of choice, while others have none. This may surprise you, because you'd think these programs would be uncontroversial. After all, they are empowering parents to choose the school or decentralized form of learning that works best for their child. So why aren't choice programs ubiquitous? Unfortunately, entrenched special interests are keen on protecting traditional public schools, no matter the cost to students or to our country. This is true even if schools are demonstrably failing students, as we saw earlier. The primary leaders of that charge, unfortunately, are teachers' unions, and often the politicians whose races they fund. They have fomented the powerful narrative that school choice, quote, siphons money from public schools, end quote. And they are technically correct. Every time a student takes her backpack funding elsewhere, the traditional public school she would have attended is not going to get the $15,000 or $38,000 in New York City tied to that child. The better question to ask these opponents of school choice is why they refuse to take money away from a school that is failing. After all, it's unlikely that traditional public schools in affluent suburbs will hemorrhage students. Whole families relocated so that kids could attend those schools. No, instead, it will likely be the inner city schools that will lose students due to choice. But if these schools are not working for those students, who is the state to step in to tell them they must stay? The kicker is that union leaders and politicians opposed to school choice almost always send their children to suburban public schools or expensive private schools. They exercise choice for their kids, but do not want others to have it. A particularly egregious example emerged this week. The president of the Chicago Teachers Union announced she would be sending her son to a Catholic school costing $16,000 a year. Yet she is currently working to end the only school choice program in Illinois. That program provides about 9,000 scholarships to low-income students. The program had over 31,000 applicants, or over 3 times the number of spots. But the union has been lobbying aggressively to end it, repeating the same talking point that it takes money from district schools. Yet these are the same district schools they deem unfit for their own children. The politics of school choice are nasty, and I will not dwell on them. But one other facet bears mention. Remember those long charter waitlists we discussed? In many cities, the traditional public school, i.e. Chicago public schools, decides whether or not a new charter can open. As you can imagine, they do not make that process easy. Sometimes they deny the charter application altogether, despite charter schools having success and a waitlist. The rationale, you guessed it, fear of diverting money from public schools. We profile a charter school in the book who experienced this exact issue in Chicago. Okay, I've just thrown a lot of information at you. This seems like a big, complicated, possibly unsolvable problem. So now I'm going to give you the pitch about why you should care. After all, for many of you, your formal education may be nearing its end if you're a student, or may have already concluded if you're in the working world. But I'd like to challenge you to think about this problem differently. To care about American education is to care about America. It's to care about the future of our children, on the most basic level, whether they can read and write. It's about caring about the possibility of true upward mobility, national security, the rule of law, the functioning of government, global competitiveness, educating for jobs that don't yet exist, and so much more. To make this more concrete, let's return to Peoria, Illinois. I already noted the dismal outcomes in some of their district schools. Caterpillar, the Fortune 100 maker of construction and mining equipment, maintained its corporate headquarters in Peoria from 1930 until 2017. In 2017, Caterpillar moved its headquarters to Texas, citing talent attraction as a key reason. The CEO stated publicly that 60% of the locals who applied to work were not qualified for lack of basic reading or math skills. Where will our industries go if every city and town in America falls this behind academically? Will we train and equip the necessary leaders to run our country? Will we ever be able to seriously say to our children that this is a country of equal opportunity if the wealthy can choose private schools, some win the lottery, and others are trapped in their zip code? Those questions need not be rhetorical. There's reason for hope, if not optimism. There are small or large things we can all do to work towards some of the school choice solutions I've outlined here and that are in our book. At the most micro level, you can vote. Vote for ballot initiatives supporting school choice, or for school board candidates who support giving parents more say over their child's education. And I see some students in the room, so I'm going to give some specific guidance tailored to you. If you're planning to practice law after graduation, consider litigating to defend and expand school choice programs. If you opt to work in business, consider the potential for startups and new education-focused companies. Entities helping ESA programs are especially needed to ensure that these programs operate smoothly. For example, one Notre Dame law grad named Joseph O'Connor recently founded a startup called Odyssey. He created a technology platform that helps parents access funding from various school choice programs. In just 1 year, it helped distribute over $110 million to the parents of more than 67,000 students. If you're heading into policymaking at the state or federal level, think about how school choice can be incentivized and enabled through new laws. And consider whether new school models we haven't even thought of could be created. Perhaps models, which are common in other countries, especially in Europe, that encourage early apprenticeships in professions, or more hybrid education that blends homeschooling with traditional classroom learning, or programs focused on technology or engineering or foreign language or the great books, or schools that serve needy students all year round to avoid summer learning loss. There's so much we could be doing differently. We need to create an education system as diverse as the children it serves. If you're not sure what you want to do after graduation, but know you want to give back to this important area of American life, consider teaching. I am obviously a graduate of Notre Dame's ACE program, and I recommend it wholeheartedly. My time in the classroom helped me better understand policy, especially how it relates to Catholic schools. And I learned to appreciate some of the practical and logistical challenges of school choice implementation. Teaching was also a wonderful opportunity to serve my students and school community. Even if you do not pursue teaching full-time after graduation, consider volunteering as a tutor or professional mentor in a school. On a more personal level, if you're blessed to have a family, think critically about the school options available to you. Vote with your feet if you can. Just like some families move to a state with lower taxes, consider settling in a state with a school choice policy that will enable you to have many options. In short, I think there are many ways we can contribute our unique talents to solve some of the challenges our education system is facing. Of course, no policy is a panacea. No school is a substitute for a strong family. And we must be cautious of thinking of school choice in that way. But we know that schools of choice are creating better opportunities for children. And we know they are empowering parents in a way that the traditional district school system has failed to do for decades. That alone makes school choice worth striving for. Thank you for your attention today, and I'll turn it over to Professor Garnett for some commentary and questions.
Well, thank you for having me here. I've known Kate a long time, and it's really a privilege. I just want to just ask Kate a couple questions, but she mentioned that there's reason for hope. I'd like to give you some real reason for hope. You went back 100 years ago. In 1990, the first modern school choice program serving 500 kids in Milwaukee, low-income kids, was enacted, and they could only go to secular schools. 5 years later, that program was expanded to include religious schools, and a new program was enacted for low-income kids in Cleveland that included religious schools. And then 1 year after that, I moved to DC as a lawyer to work for Clint Bullock, Kate's boss. I cry a lot about this. Anyway, so at that time, these programs were being challenged on Establishment Clause grounds. One of these cases eventually became the Zellman case that I worked on as a very baby lawyer. About that, so in 1996, a year after I graduated from law school, I think it's fair to say there were about 2,000 kids in 2 states on private school choice programs. In the year that Kate and Clint published their book, there were about 500,000 kids in 30-some states on parental choice programs. And in 2024, 10 million children will be eligible to participate in one of these programs. Sorry. So depending on how you count, since Kate and Clint wrote their book, about a dozen states have enacted new programs or expanded existing programs to be universal eligibility. Arkansas, Arizona, Indiana, Iowa, Florida, North Carolina, Ohio, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Utah, and West Virginia. And I was just giving a talk in DC on Wednesday, and let's cross our fingers, Texas is close, which should be an incredible game changer. So there's so much hope. 10 million kids, 10 million parents. Now, obviously, only a fraction of these parents will take advantage of this opportunity. 10 million parents next year will be empowered to choose their children's future, which is incredible. And as Catholics, it's particularly incredible because we know that parents are the first and the best educators of their children. And before I ask Kate questions about that, I just also want to do the little teacher gig and say, so COVID, as Kate pointed out, according to the National Assessment for Academic, the nation's report card, it wiped away about 20 years of learning gains, more than 30 years for Black kids. There was one kind of school where kids didn't lose anything. In fact, these schools, if they were a state, would have been number 1 across the country, number 1 for Hispanics, number 1 for low-income kids, and number 2 for Black kids. Does anyone make a guess about what schools those were? Catholic schools. Catholic schools did not, the kids didn't lose any learning. We opened as soon as we possibly could because we believe that education is a gift, and it's a gift to be shared in a community. So I think a lot of these kids are now 2 or 3 years behind where they started, which was not at grade level. So these opportunities kids desperately need it, so we couldn't ask for anything more. Okay, so I'm gonna ask Kate 2 questions, and then I think I'll start with the first, which we were talking about this before. As I mentioned, there's a couple things that have happened. My 2 questions are about these 2 things. I think there are 2 trends that have gone together in the last 2 years that have led these states to do this. The first is a trend toward the sort of unshackled system, the decentralized system, toward away from what is school choice to pure parental choice, really saying we're going to give parents resources to unbundle their kids' education if that's what they choose. That's my second question about that. But the second, though, is a move from means testing to universal eligibility. So back in my baby lawyer days when I was fighting, all these programs were low-income kids. As one of my personal heroes, the architect of the first voucher program in Milwaukee, Howard Fuller, likes to say, school choice really was for most of these last 30 years. It's more of a rescue mission than a fight for broad social change. And I think we might see universal school choice as more of a fight for broad social change than it is as a rescue mission. So we're moving to letting everyone be eligible, which has political benefits, but we lose the rhetoric and perhaps sort of the moral weight of the fight for broad social change, the rescue mission aspect of it. So I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, thanks, Professor. So I am of the mind more in the Howard Fuller camp of things. I think we should be giving these programs to the students who need them the most first. So I would, if I were, waving my magic wand and setting up these programs nationwide, I would have all of them be means tested at the federal poverty level. Now, that said, I think one of the potential benefits of the universal is that it gets more people invested in these programs and more middle-class families who perhaps have different levels of political capital. I remember when I was working on my thesis, my professor here at Notre Dame quipped that, when we really get suburban soccer moms involved and excited about school choice, that's when we'll start to see change. And that was COVID. So I think, in an ideal world, we would make all of these things means tested because we want them to help the most struggling students in the most struggling urban schools. But I see a glimmer of goodness in the universal push as well.
Okay, so that actually feeds into my second question. One reason why universal, another possible good, is it's easier for schools to understand and to implement. So if you live in the state of Indiana as of this summer, and you're not in the top, is it 2% of income earners in the state of Indiana? If you're not in the top 2%, you get a $7,500 for your kid to go to school, if you want to send your kid to a private school. So Father Drew here runs a school. 100% of your kids, I assume, are
We have one family from Michigan, so everyone else.
everyone but the one family from Michigan at St. Adalbert's. He sends a list to the state. The state sends, is it $7,500 now or a little less? I don't know, for elementary school, something like that. So it's easy to understand. It's easy for parents to understand because you can say, you know what, you live in Indiana, you want your kid to go to Catholic school, it's free. That's easy. So that's one other reason. So it's easier to implement. Complex eligibility requirements make it harder to implement these programs. But I want to talk to you, I want you to speak a little bit. It's funny, Kate wrote this book with Clint 2 years ago, and right after it was published, I did this book event with them on Zoom. And I said, this is never going to happen. You're never going to get these states to pass ESAs. And even if you do, it's going to be a disaster because they're so hard to implement. No parent is ever going to sign on to customizing their kid's education. So it turns out she's right politically. I was wrong. Thanks be to God. I'm so happy. But I do still wonder about implementation. And I'm just going to ask a couple. So first of all, you mentioned Joe Connor, who's my former research assistant, who started this. He's an amazing guy, former teacher, started this program that runs ESA programs because they're so hard. Like, it's one thing to send money to St. Adalbert. It's another if the family at St. Adalbert has a child with dyslexia and wants to get a tutor, or a child that has cerebral palsy and wants horse therapy, which is a refundable expense in some of these states. So if you want to, it's just really hard. So you have to have some kind of complex financial mechanism. You have to make sure there isn't fraud, or at least front or back end. But you also have to explain what an ESA is to parents who may not speak English, parents who are busy. And you have to explain, schools have to start thinking about, do we unbundle? Do we offer like 2 classes a day? What does that do to our community? What if someone says, I want math and science for you, but I really want to take music at the public school, but I also want to play soccer. So I'm coming to St. Joe for 2 periods a day. So what's your price for that? So I just think that these implementation challenges for ESAs are particularly challenging, except for when they're just used as a voucher, which is probably what they'll mostly be used in the short term. And so who's ever, before you heard her say it, who has heard of a micro school? Okay, so you guys are like well-educated people. I mean, a lot of people would be like, what's a micro school, right? Like you could do a learning pod, Like the woman's like, what? I gotta work. I mean, so I think these are really hard to implement. And I wonder if you have thought about that and what states and advocates in schools could do to overcome those implementation challenges.
Yeah, I think, I got a really good question from a student this morning, actually, along these lines. And his, question was, well, aren't you just losing the idea of a school community if you micro school? So, one of the great advantages of Catholic schools, I'm thinking of the one where I taught, the kids, it was their family. A lot of them came from broken homes and they came to school and they felt like this was their family. And I think that is certainly something that can be lost with a more micro school or more decentralized option. So I think we need to be careful about, passing ESAs and encouraging decentralization for the sake of decentralization. I think we should also be encouraging, I mean, if we had our way, there would be a voucher, a tax credit scholarship, and an ESA in every state, right? I mean, giving too much implementation.
One program, make it simple. The more programs, the more confusing. No.
If I had, that's a very good point.
One very well-funded program.
Yes. Okay, that's good. So, but getting back to addressing your question, I think, one of the keys, I think, is getting the information out to parents, because when I would have parent-teacher conferences at my Catholic school, I would, do my informal surveys of them, and I would say, like, how did you find this school? Every student at my school got a scholarship to attend, because this was pre-Illinois tax credit scholarship. So I would ask the parents, and I would say, how did you find this school? And frequently it was word of mouth, people in their community. Frequently it was their church. So I think, getting the word out there, and I think that's something that, there's another role for a startup or a business like what Joe is doing to really help, how do we communicate to parents, here are the spectrum of options that are available to you with this ESA. But I think, really key for personalizing learning, and I agree with you that most of them will probably be used like a voucher at a school, but just even having that extra, $1,000 to pay a tutor if your kid is really behind in a subject, I think can make all the difference. So that's a real advantage of those programs that the other ones that I mentioned lack.
Yeah, I'm on the OCC committee on Catholic education. I'm actually not on it, because you have to be a bishop to be on it. I am a consultant. But they just did an implementation thing for the bishops and superintendents in states that got these programs. And I was very impressed. Like, one thing that Utah is doing is they've talked to every pastor at every church, and they got baptismal records of everybody who's in religious ed, and they had a database. And they made the database available to all the Catholic schools, so they could recruit. So like, those are the kinds of things I think you have to really focus on. I just think I know there must be questions. I mean, one other implementation thing I think that we all need to think about, and maybe Kate, you've thought about this. I have watched over 30 years as parental choice has sort of fallen short, perhaps, of its potential. Like, part of it is because of bad program design. Part of it is because we've gone alone for so long. We assume all of our problems are money problems, and we don't really resolve to leverage the funds to improve. Do you think that is a concern? I think, particularly like in Catholic schools, we might think we're better than we are. And do you have any thoughts about how that might be addressed?
Yeah, so what I learned through the course of working on this book, I spent a lot of time visiting schools, and it's actually this sounds, sacrilegious considering where we are right now, but some of my favorite schools to visit were actually charter schools, because they were the ones kind of breaking, if you go back to my first slide, that desks and rows model. So my Catholic school, still very desks and rows, very traditional, had definite advantages to the public school system, but the mode and all the curriculum was still pretty much the same. Now, charter schools, and we profile a couple of these in the book, I went and visited, interviewed their founders, super, super interesting things that they're doing to really just change the way students are learning. So, for example, there's a school in Chicago, and they, don't have traditional classrooms. So they have a center where students rotate throughout the day. They will do small group discussion about a book with 5 or 7 other students in a circle, and then they'll go and do some individualized math work, and they'll have a tutor come to them when they raise their hand, and then they'll go to a section where they're doing some sort of online learning program that is giving them questions tailored to their ability. And that school it was started by 2 former TFA members, and just completely blew my mind. No, it's, I'm blanking on the name right now. It's not Basis, but it's similar to Basis. But serving a similar population to my Catholic school, and really just blowing it out of the water with. So I think that's definitely something that Catholic schools could learn from, and truly like being more innovative in the way we are teaching and what we are teaching too.
Please.
Are we done?
No, let's
Yeah,
open
yeah,
it up.
yeah, open it up to any questions?
We have a
Yes, sir.
tradition of, hold on,
Sorry.
a tradition of our youngest current students. Any students, undergraduate students? Yeah, and stand up and tell us who you are, and we have a microphone that's going to come around to you. The microphone is for the recording.
Yeah, it's on.
Intrinsic is
Go ahead,
the,
stand up.
they have three.
Just,
three
it's just gonna capture, it's just gonna capture you coming this
Go
way,
ahead,
so
okay.
you're fine.
Basis is the AP.
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm part of the Tocqueville Fellowship. My question is coming from my personal experience. Both of my parents are public school teachers, and so I look at the education system through that kind of perspective. And I was wondering if you could touch a little bit about the role of teachers in reforming education, because obviously teachers are kind of the most important part of the education system in terms of they're the ones that are going to be educating the children. So if you just touch about, I read a little bit of the chapter in your book about that aspect, but you didn't talk about your talk.
Repeat the question for the.
Sure. So the question was, we have a student who is the son of 2 public school teachers, which is wonderful, and he asked about the role of teachers in the school system generally. And as you mentioned, we do touch on this a little bit more in the book, and one of our proposals is that we think teachers need to be both valued and compensated more than they are. Now, this is a complicated issue because there's a lot of lobbying and a lot of stratification among states with what teachers are paid, but I think, you know, ACE does a really good job of this, and Teach for America and other programs where they're recruiting really passionate college graduates. Even if you teach for 2 years, you can make a difference in your school community. So I didn't talk a lot about teachers, but I absolutely think they're one of the most key pieces of this equation. And I think, you know, people who've dedicated their lives to teaching, I respect them so much. And so tell your parents thank you.
Another student question?
Oh, sorry.
Former educator. This may be outside the purview. I think you might have just addressed it a little bit, but I'm wondering about how, in my mind, the most important person in a classroom is the teacher. I mean, she is the one that's educating these students, and she is the one that is giving him or her, I should say, all the love and attention that these kids need. And then it comes down to salary. What are these teachers making? When I taught, I had this wonderful Notre Dame grad who was making decent salary. I was teaching at a parochial school, which was really dedication. So we could afford to raise our 2 daughters because we had 2 salaries. But, you know, a lot of women and men don't have that. So I'm looking at, you know, the list of all these nations that are above us. What are they giving their teachers? What are their teachers' salaries? Are they that much better than the United States? Is that making a difference also? It just makes, you know, me wonder. Because I had a good friend that taught with me.
Man, let's get, we're going to get as many questions as possible. So on the salaries.
Sorry? So on salaries, I mean, Kay can answer this too, but I do think teachers are underpaid. And the parochial system, and private schools can take advantage of the resources to raise teacher salaries and have, including in our own state. It wasn't without bumps, but we did raise teacher salaries. The other thing that's really interesting, like in these reforms in the last 2 years, a lot of them bundled private school choice with dramatic in both and. So not just where we fund this public schools more and public school teachers in particular more, while at the same time giving parents more options.
There's another question back there. Yeah.
Student, sorry.
Hello, I'm a freshman here. I'm a recent graduate of Chicago Catholic High School, and I'm very fortunate to receive financial assistance from Empower Illinois, which is one of the greatest school choice options in Illinois as of right now. I was just wondering, from a long-term perspective, broadening the school choice options for parents does predict kind of a movement to the Catholic or private school institutions, at least within where I live. What would you foresee the future of traditional public schooling to be if there is a movement away from them? I mean, isn't the goal to bring up all schools together? what would be your answer to that?
Absolutely. Thank you for, so the question was if we are moving more and more students from traditional public schools into Catholic and private schools, what does that do to schools overall and traditional public schools? So I think a really good example, and this is in the last chapter of the book, we talk about Florida. So Florida has perhaps been, it wasn't the first, I mean, Milwaukee was truly the first, but Florida has been kind of the vanguard of a large school choice program. And you've actually seen improvements in their public schools since the school choice program has been going. So we don't know, it's difficult to isolate the causal mechanism and what exactly is driving that change, but what we see is that students are choosing the tax credit scholarship in Florida. They're choosing to go to the Catholic school. Enrollment in Florida is booming and has boomed during COVID even more. But what we also see is that their public schools have been improving too. So again, it's I'm not gonna try to guess among the complicated causal mechanisms why the public schools are improving, but it could be that the teachers are dealing with fewer students. Some of the most struggling students perhaps are going to Catholic schools or to charter schools. We don't really know, but I think that's Florida. You can look to Florida as a good example where we have a choice program and it actually is going to help the traditional public schools as well.
I think almost every study has suggested that competition improves the performance of public schools. It's like the one thing we know about school choice. The other thing that's interesting to your question is all this stuff has come along in the private schools choice and charter schools has also in most states been accompanied by more and more public school choice and more porous school district boundaries. So you have, no one could say it's not going to be disruptive. It is, but sometimes disruption is okay. But parents in a lot of these states can now send their kids to other public school districts than the one where they live, which is also a great option for many families.
I think there's a couple questions back over here in the back corner.
Hi, I'm Sarah from M.Ed, 2019 grad and Tocqueville alum. I was wondering if you could give us an update on the status of Blaine amendments and where they stand as far as getting in the way of different school choice programs in different states.
I'm gonna let Professor Garnett take this one.
So when I was at IJ in 1996, I filed the first lawsuit challenging the exclusion of religious schools from a voucher program in Maine. And the Supreme Court finally last year in a different lawsuit said I was right all along and said it was violated the First Amendment's free exercise clause to exclude religious schools from Maine's town tuitioning program, and I really cried. But that's what that case and a couple others stand for is a basic proposition that if a state doesn't have to fund private education, but if it chooses to do so, it may not exclude religious schools from the options available to parents. And although Maine doesn't have a Blaine Amendment, Blaine Amendments are state establishment clauses, basically, and they typically say no money to public funds can go to sectarian schools. They have a very ugly anti-Catholic history. But the Carson case and a couple of others basically wipe Blaine's off the books because the state cannot say, well, we can't include religious schools because our state constitution they're blocking us from doing so because that's not, the federal constitution trumps the state constitution. So that's really great news. There are a few states where they have Blaine amendments that prohibit all funding of private education, and those are still, Michigan is one, Massachusetts, but those are still problematic, but mostly Blaine Amendment arguments are dead. It's great.
Other questions from over here? With the microphones over here? Right in front.
My name is Jack, and I'm a 1L here at the law school. My question is, how do we ensure that in states where there is no school choice programs currently, that there remains options by the time that they implement school choice policies, with parochial schools oftentimes closing down and there being charter caps? How do we ensure that there are options available for families once those school choice policies do get implemented?
Yeah, thank you. So the question was, how do we, if schools are closing at high rates in states without choice programs, how do we make sure they're still there when the program, if it's eventually passed and implemented? So if I had the answer to that question, I would. I don't know. It's a real issue, and what we've seen is that sometimes a Catholic school isn't even closing, but what they'll do. This happened in Tennessee, where the Catholic school actually just became a charter, but it moved all of the religious iconography, instruction, mass outside the confines of the 8 to 4 school day. So you've seen some schools actually continue to exist. They say we need to become a charter, because if they're a charter, then they automatically qualify for that public money. But of course, that destroys the Catholic identity of the school. So, I mean, I don't know if Professor Garnett is going to agree with this, but I mentioned the religious charter in Oklahoma, and it's still, unsettled legally whether that's going to be allowed to persist. But if we get to a point where Catholic schools are able to declare and be charters, potentially they're going to be able to get money much more quickly than waiting for a voucher, tax credit, scholarship to be passed. So it's a high risk, high reward proposition, I think, right now with that. But that's one potential answer to your question.
Right. So in the interest of full disclosure, St. Isidore of Sevilla Catholic Virtual School is my client. So one argument is the reason, just what you said, that it's just unconstitutional to tell a Catholic school, if you want public funds, you have to secularize. That's what Carson versus Macon stands for. So that's the argument that's being made in Oklahoma, where the school has been approved and there's ongoing litigation against the school and the state and lots of lawyers. One of the bad guys, the opponents of that's filed a lawsuit in Oklahoma is called the Freedom From Religion Foundation, which tells you where they stand. But so that's one possibility, although with charter caps and other things, I think it's not likely that we'll have a bunch of religious charter schools, and it's a long way away from the legal issues being settled. I think, it's an imperfect answer, but private philanthropy is key. And, a lot of Catholics have given of their time, talent, and treasure to Catholic education for many, many years. We built the greatest, largest private school system in the world on the backs of immigrants who had nothing. So, we need to continue to remember that. Also to remember, this is back to my point about we might not be as good as we think we are, that we can also, by improving, we can attract more customers, and that will help. But it's still heartbreaking. The Archdiocese of New York closed 12 schools this year, kicking out about 3,000 kids in the Bronx and Harlem. Many of those schools were not empty. They had 350 kids in them. So it just was, the money proposition didn't matter. It was just so terrible.
Okay, I think we have time for one more back over here. Hi, I'm Will. I'm a junior constitutional studies minor. A lot of people point to government involvement in higher education, like through guaranteeing low-income student loans, as disrupting, one, like massively raising the price of colleges, and two, even disrupting the quality of the education you get. Schools move towards other things. LSU installs a lazy river. It creates issues like that. Do you see there being dangers with messing with the actual quality of the education you're getting by having such a large transfer program?
No, I think the quality of, so one key difference is that, colleges and universities, so sure, they're getting, subsidized federal loans, but also they have endowments. And a Catholic school is relying on the voucher money to keep its lights on. So I think the money there's little risk of the money kind of corrupting the school or being used wastefully. They need that money. They could pay teachers more with it. They could, start a new language program, or you name it. So I think that's the key difference. It's hard to analogize school choice to the types of federal loan programs that we have to go to higher education.
I would say, I'm no fan of Mr. Jefferson, but Thomas Jefferson said eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. And I do think that it's not out of bounds to worry, like in the higher education context, that government funds could come with government control. And we have to, in the religious sector, fight for our First Amendment rights. We also just have to be very, very vigilant and not allow that to happen. And yeah, we have to worry about inflation. I think in Iowa and other places you've seen tuition going up really fast, and some of it's just because the schools are underpriced and they need to increase the cost to pay the teachers more. But if you double your tuition when you get an ESA, it's a bad look. So
I appreciate the invitation to discuss all the ways that Louisiana State University is wasting its money. It can go on for a long time, but we should conclude. Kate, Nicole, thank you so much. Please join me. Let me remind you, the bookstore has brought some copies of Unshackled, and Kate, you'll sign copies, so if you want to pick one up, it's right outside. We'll have Kate available to sign them. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yes.
Hope it was what you're looking for, but good.